Good morning, everyone. On behalf of CISO Platform, I would like to welcome you to our first ever virtual summit and to this session. It's been 10 years since we started the CISO Platform community with the vision of collaboration among senior security executives. Today, our community has over 40,000 members across globe. We are here for the session on hacking web application API, trends and risks. The session will be presented by Kyle Lai. Kyle is the founder and CISO at KLC Consulting. He is the former CISO of Pactera, a global IT services firm, and Brandeis University Hellas School. Kyle has over 20 plus years of experience in cybersecurity, focusing on software, network, infrastructure, vulnerability management, third-party risk management, regulatory compliance, and privacy. Kyle has consulted at Zoom, ExxonMobil, Microsoft, HP, Fidelity Investments, Boeing, and US Department of Defense. He is also the creator of network security and privacy tool, a SMAC MAC address changer, which has over 3 million users worldwide. This session will be 40 minutes long. As for the audience, if you have any questions for the speaker at any point during the session, you can drop it in the chat box of your control panel. Speaker will address them from time to time or at the end of the session. Thank you so much for joining us, Kyle. Over to you.
Hi, everyone. Yeah, thank you for having me. So why are we talking about web application and API today? According to Akamai's State of Internet Security report, 83% of the web traffic is API traffic, right? And according to Verizon Data Breach Investigation Report, 43% of all the data breaches are through the web application. And 90% of the hacking-related breaches are actually through the web application as an attack vector. And this is actually a 20% increase from the previous year's report. So you can see it's actually become a favorite target for the attackers. That's why we're talking about web application and API security. Here are some recent data breaches attacking the web application and the APIs. So Airtel, you probably know, it's an Indian telecom. They actually have an API-based vulnerability in the My Airtel application, which actually exposed 300 million users' personal information. US Post Office recently have web API vulnerability, which left about 60 million users exposed their personal information. Right? Facebook also have similar problem. Their developer API exposed tens of millions of users. Starbucks just happened last month in June 2020. One of the security researcher found a directory traversal flaw of their internally exposed API. They're not supposed to expose to outside, which left 100 million customers exposed. Obviously, this is done by a security researcher. If it's actually been done by a malicious attacker, yeah, the results will be devastating for Starbucks. You probably heard of Google Plus have a security bug on their API, which resulted in Google shutting down the Google Plus. Right, so these are really real attacks and real problems that the company they are facing right now. All right, so this is just an example of what's a modern web application architecture. I'm not trying to show you the entire architecture. It's just to show you that there's a web application, there's a mobile application in the front, but in the back end, there's the APIs. There are API gateways talking to different APIs that's supporting the application. Right, so this is the modern application. A lot of them are API driven. And before we get into the new trend of web application and API vulnerabilities, I want to do a review on what are some of the top 10 vulnerabilities. You probably are familiar with OWASP top 10. There are OWASP top 10 web application security risks. The latest version is 2017. They started doing the OWASP top 10 since 2003. And these are the top 10 on the left side. You can see these are the OWASP top 10. A couple of them, injection and the cross-site scripting has been existed since 2003. So yeah, it's been there, 17, 18 years already. And on the right side, this probably a little bit less known, but this is a OWASP top 10 API security risk. It just came out late 2019. There are 10 of them. We can just go through it quickly, one by one. There's a broken object level authorization, broken user authentication, excessive data exposure. Number 4 is the lack of resources and rate limiting. Number 5, broken function level authorization. Number 6, mass assignment. Security. Number 7, security misconfiguration. Number 8, injection. Number 9, improper asset management. Number 10, insufficient logging and monitoring. The reason I just want to go through it, you can see I already make some red lines. There are 5 of them. They're kind of, you can actually map from the API security to the web application security. So on the right side, there are a lot of authorization and authentication type of vulnerabilities. Okay, so let's get into our topic here. Trending vulnerabilities. So I have listed 7 vulnerabilities that we see recently, and these are actually based on our analysis on the observation of the Fortune 500 clients, and observation on the SaaS, the software as a service clients, and also look at the public disclosed vulnerabilities from the bug bounty firms. So they do make some of the public disclosed vulnerabilities available. And also the CVE, common vulnerability and exposure. If the user need to do something about the software, then they issue the CVE. But if there are server-side vulnerabilities that do not require user to do anything, they don't issue the CVE. So just make a note of it. I did not include the cross-site scripting or SQL injection on this list. They still exist, but we know that in terms of the trending is still out there. A lot of the application, they do have this vulnerability, but I'm really focusing on talking about the trending of the newer vulnerabilities that we see. Okay, so let's go through it. First one is OAuth, misconfiguration in secure implementation. We're seeing this vulnerabilities trending up. It's actually pretty complex. We're going to have a slide talking a little bit more about OAuth. OAuth vulnerability is really surrounding the protection of access token and URL redirect or redirect URI. The second one is over permission on the data access. It's one of the OWASP top 10 AI security risks. And usually these are due to the misconfiguration on the authentication, or sometimes they just lack of authentication all at once. They're probably a misconfiguration or misimplementation on the OAuth scope, or just API access control. Right. Next one is the insecure direct object reference, IDOR. This is actually a little bit surprising to me because I'm seeing more and more of IDOR vulnerabilities. This has been out there since 2007, but it still exists. And we're going to have a slide talking about the IDOR, why it's actually become a problem. Why is there a number actually going up on the IDOR vulnerabilities? Okay, but IDOR is really surrounding the lack of authentication and authorization. The next one is the missing API security controls, rate limiting specifically, seeing a little bit more of rate limiting issues. Either they forgot to put a rate limiting or just have some misconfiguration and they have a rate limiting turned off. And that there are some cross-origin resource sharing, some of that as well. But yeah, rate limiting is obviously a control to prevent denial of service, DDoS attacks, to prevent overuse of your resources, or just to prevent password brute force attacks, right? We have seen a big company actually have this rate limiting issue that caused the password brute force attacks. Okay. The next one is a secret in the code and the configuration files, seeing a lot of these on the GitHub. So a lot of the attackers, they are going to GitHubs to find the secrets. So example, one of the major coffee chain, they actually have this problem earlier, in January 2020. Right? They actually have a security researcher found a secret, which is the API key that's actually used for their internal systems as well. So luckily, it's been found by the security researcher. They got a bounty. However, if it's a real attacker, that'll be very devastating for this coffee chain. Okay. And then there's a server-side request forgery. We're seeing an uptick on this one as well. right? Server-side request forgery is when the attacker allow the server-side code to execute the URL they provide, without authorization, obviously. Okay, on the next one is the third-party open source component vulnerability. We're seeing more and more of this. We have a few slides on this one as well, but just to let you know that if you are using a third-party or open source component with a vulnerability, your application or API become vulnerable as well. Okay, so let's dig in a little bit deeper on the OAuth. So OAuth, it's a complex protocol, right? Authentication protocol, and but it's actually very widely used. Just an example on the right on top here, you can see this is an authorization code flow. There are 6 steps here. This from authorization request all the way to getting the access token and getting to use the resources. So it's quite a complex protocol for authentication. It's been very widely used, very popular, so we are seeing out there, but it's very easily to make a mistake in terms of the configuration or implementation. The redirect of the URI is not validated. Redirect URI is one of the parameter to tell the OAuth authorization server where to send your token to, right? So if you have a redirect URI, you can potentially sending the access token to the attacker. And then when you send the access token to the attacker, it's pretty much game over. That the attacker will take over the account or the session, right? The access token protection, there's a leak of an access token that we definitely have seen. There's an uptick on that as well. Just to give you a sense of what's involved, why it's complex. So on the bottom, here's a OAuth parameter. This is not all of the OAuth, by the way. This is just some of the OAuth parameters. There's a JWT token that's a little bit more involved on the authentication, and they have a whole different series of the parameters there too as well. But just want to show you there are 16 parameters for containing the initial content here that if you are asking the developers, how do you actually implement the scope and the state, they probably cannot tell you really well in terms of what is the right way to do it. So this is something that you want to pay attention to and to make sure that the organization is training the developers to be familiar with the OAuth, modern authentication here. Let's take a look at the next slide. Here are some of the attack methods. This is a list. There's actually a publication done by the Internet Engineering Task Force here. And in this publication, they talk about the security best practices of OAuth 2.0. And they have listed 14 OAuth attacks and mitigations. So these are highly recommend you to introduce this to the developers, your pen testers, and also your engineers. So they are familiar with what are some of these attacks methods and what is the mitigation, because these are really valuable resources. And the more you give them, the more they understand how the attacks happens, the more they understand how the mitigation should be done, the better they'll actually make their application authentication process as well. Okay. And the next one is the open source component vulnerabilities. So as I have mentioned, this has been in the OWASP top 10 for the 2007 version. Open source components has been used by developers a lot. Right? Most of the developers, if you ask them, they probably will tell you they are using some of the open source code. Let's take a look at the statistics on the right side. So 2020 open source security and the risk analysis report stated that 99% of all the commercial code bases they have assessed in 2019 have open source code in there. So I think they are just be a little bit cautious. Instead of saying 100%, they say 99%. But there are just a lot of the software, the web application and the APIs, they do have the open source code in there. Let's take a look 33% of the application security vulnerabilities are the result of a open source the vulnerability of the open source components. Right, so that's pretty significant. You have to see that, if you don't secure your open source components, your application is vulnerable, right? And 39% of the firms saying that they are going to do software composition analysis, which is another synonymous for open source component vulnerability scanning or the analysis during the testing phase. 37% say they will do it in the development phase. So what we're talking about here is the software development lifecycle, right? So we want to do the open source component vulnerability assessment scanning as early as possible. If you do it in the development phase, you are letting the developer choose a secure or less vulnerable open source components to use during the development phase. So when it comes to the testing phase, most likely you already have a clean, very secure, less vulnerable open source components, right? So you don't have to ask the developers to do too much at that time. But if you do your third-party components or open source components scanning during the testing phase, there's a chance that you are finding a lot of vulnerable open source components, and you have to ask the developers to go back and redo the development. So there's going to be a lot of time wasted, and your security team, they're not going to be popular, right? So to reduce the friction between the security team and the development team, you probably want to have them do the open source scanning as early as possible. Okay, and also just want to mention that open source component vulnerability scanning or vulnerability management is not easy, right? Usually there's a lack of process and a lack of tools to let you examine the open source components. Just to let you know, there are hundreds of new open source components published every day, and there are new vulnerabilities being discovered every day, maybe tens or hundreds of them, right? So all these tools, the open source management tools, they usually cannot keep up, right? So they're still growing. They don't have all the new open source components. So there is a lack of tools right now. So that's become a bit of a challenge. And also these tools don't tell you, by default, hey, here are the thousands of vulnerabilities that we have found, right? The tool has found. What are some of the top vulnerabilities or real vulnerabilities that you should fix, right? So that become a challenge for the developers as well. Because like, hey, there are thousands of vulnerabilities. Which one should I fix? Which one should I patch? Because there are going to be a lot. Nowadays, we see the open source vulnerability management tool is integrated with the static code analysis tool, the secure code review tools. So that probably help a little bit because they can identify what are the real open source components that's actually being used. Okay. All right, so on the last bullet here, security team usually under the pressure not to interfere with the developers because the direction coming from the senior management. Okay. Senior management want to have the developer develop new features, push out to the production as fast as possible. So sometimes the security team, they don't want to be on the way, right? Developer, they probably will use some of the open source components they just released yesterday, right? And so that become a challenge because developers might be bringing in some of the unauthorized open source components or some vulnerable open source components into the organization. Okay. Just another note here about the open source component. You probably have to look at the licensing as well. Licensing some of the open source components, they have the copy left. Copy left means that if I do something to the code, right, over the open source code, I have to make my code available. There's another risk that you have to make sure that you look into, right? Only use the open source components that doesn't have the copy left clause in there. Okay. All right. Let's take a look at the IDOR, the Insecure Direct Object Reference Vulnerability. So as I mentioned, this have been there since 2007, right? Take a look at what is IDOR. On the right side, it's a very quick, simple example. If I am the user, right, I log into the application, I'm giving the ID as 1234. If I changed my ID to 1235, if I'm a bad guy, get into another user ID 1235 without any authentication requirements, then there's this IDOR vulnerability, right? Because I'm unauthorized, but I can actually see other people's information just by changing the ID. Right, just an example here. So we're seeing a lot more of the IDOR problems recently. Web application is becoming more complex. There are a number of APIs for each application, each web application now. So some of the web application even have hundreds of APIs, and the APIs have different parameters, right? So it might not have been checked properly for the authentication and authorization for all the different APIs. So you might ask, hey, I do use automated static and dynamic vulnerability scanning tools in my environment. So is this going to be a problem? IDOR is not easy to be detected by the automated tools. So whether it's the static or the dynamic vulnerability scanning tools, right? So, and the reason is that these automated tools, they lack the context of what the parameters that are being used in the application and the APIs. So the best way to do it is to do it manual, unfortunately, more manual vulnerability assessment or penetration testing. Because a lot of companies, they skip this step. They go through the DevOps pipeline using some of the quick security checks, but they don't have the manual penetration testing or vulnerability assessment. So they don't pick up the IDOR vulnerabilities. So that's why you're seeing more and more IDOR vulnerabilities out there, okay? And IDOR most likely is going to exist in the next few years. Okay, so let's take a look at misconfiguration as well, because this misconfiguration is what we see as a problem out there. Okay, because if you don't have a secure configuration, you're going to introduce the vulnerabilities to your application and the APIs. So DBIR, Verizon DBIR reports again, about 10% of all the data breaches are caused by the misconfiguration, right? And the misconfiguration has increased year to year for the past few years. If you take a look at here, 2019 report here, last year's report, it says 2018, we have 17% of all errors are misconfiguration. This year, 40% of all errors are misconfiguration. So misconfiguration more than doubled since from 2018 to 2019 here, okay? And also on the right side, so just it's an interesting statistics here. So who actually find these misconfigurations? These configurations are actually found by security researchers, the external security researchers. About 52% are found by security researchers from the outside. And another about 18% they are found by the third-party users. So about 70% of all the errors, including misconfigurations, they are found by external parties. Some of them you probably will ask, hey, should I actually start a private bug bounty program because they are found by third parties? Based on my experience, it is a good idea if you are prepared to do it, because bug bounty is a program, it have to be managed. You have to manage the external security researchers. Although they are good, sometimes it will be a little bit difficult or a lot of time and the commitment. And sometimes it's a little bit difficult to deal with the external researchers as well. So most of them are good though, but you just have to prepare to deal with them. And also some of the researchers might ask for public disclosure. So you have to be prepared. Whatever they found could be going public, right? So these are some of the concerns that you have to put in before you start the bug bounty program, just a side note. Okay. Right. So what is the complexity we're talking about here? Right. We have the cloud, we have other technologies, and developers, they are bringing in engineers, right? They are bringing in all different kind of technologies. You can see this chart here, right? So there are just so many things out there that are bringing in. And if you ask your developers and the engineers, most likely they are using many of the tools on this chart, this chart here. All right, so cloud, just want to stress, cloud has a lot of features being released every day, right? But there's a lack of understanding in terms of how to securely configure and implement them. Um, Developers, some of the developers, they are used to developing in the traditional environment, but recently there are a lot of companies that are moving to the cloud, right? So there's a paradigm shift. The way you do the development is going to be a little bit different from how you do the traditional development in the past. So you just make sure that developers, they are familiar with the cloud and also the technology and the tools and the different platforms that bring into your organization, and make sure that they are well trained. Okay. All right. So here is a recap of what we have been talking about. Why are the number of web application vulnerabilities growing? Right. So there's a growing complexity of the environment. There's insufficient training on the modern authentication, the OAuth, Open ID Connect, which is built on top of the OAuth. Right? Insufficient training on the technology platform, as well as lack of training for the developers on the secure coding practices. Just to mention there, you can train the developers on the basic secure coding practices, but what they also need to know is what are some of the new attacks, new trends of the attacks. So it's better for you to collaborate with your penetration testing team if you have one. Right? Some of the larger companies, they do have the pen testing team. So you can understand what are some of the new attacks, introduce them to the developer, give them the feedback, say, here's what we're seeing in the wild. Here's what we're seeing about the attacks that's really going against your application. So the developer is aware that these are the attacks that's going on, so they can put in some mitigation techniques into their code. Right? So penetration testing team developer, they sometimes see each other as enemies, but it will be a lot better if you bring them together and have the exchange, right? Lack of security testing. There is a little bit of a lack of security testing in the DevOps pipeline. Okay, and there's a lack of open source component vulnerability management. Just to mention here, the container, the vulnerability is really caused by the open source as well. So you should also scan the base image of the container. So make sure you have a tool scanning the base image for the containers. Right? And there's a lack of API security management we talked about, the rate limiting, and lack of manual penetration testing. Okay, and there's another thing to consider here is merger and acquisition. For the companies, when they have a merger and acquisition, they are bringing in different development teams together. Different development teams together, they have a different development experience. They follow the different security standards. They have a different security maturity between the teams. And the senior management, they have the direction, say, we want to integrate all these developers together as soon as possible. So if you're senior management in your company, when this merger and acquisition happens, you probably should bring all the developers together, give them what is the security standard, and have them work to understand what is the security standard. If there are some teams that are less mature on their security, you probably want to give them a little bit more training to make sure that you bring everybody to have a level set on their security understanding. So it will be a little bit better for all the teams to work towards the same security goals. Okay. All right. So now what? Now you know all about the vulnerabilities, right? And that's all the problems that you're having. So here is an example of the security controls that we can put in for web application architecture. This, I use Microsoft Azure as an example here, but this security controls can put into any other cloud architecture as well, whether it's AWS or others. So when the user coming into the application, we really have to make sure there's authentication and authorization in place, and make sure that authentication and authorization they're enforced. And whenever you change the authentication authorization mechanism, make sure you follow the change management and the configuration management. Make sure you document why is the change so you can always understand how the authentication authorization is done. If there are changes, make sure that you have the script to do it. Don't just go into the environment and change it manually. Okay. And also you have the web application firewall WAF, right? As you go in, you make sure that you have the web application firewall because that's how you monitor the traffic, the web traffic coming in. And then you can configure your custom rules, but make sure you enforce these rules. Okay. And also make sure you enable the security monitoring and monitor all the packing traffic as well. Make sure you have the secure configuration for the storage and the database. And also make sure you check the value that you're expecting. If there are deviations from the value, you probably want to make sure you have the automated script to reset those values because somebody might just go in and change value of the configuration. And if that's not what you expected, change it back. Okay. All right, so since we talked about the DevOps, DevSecOps, right? Adding the security to the DevOps pipeline. This is not easy. And I remember when I was talking to a developer in one of the large companies, right? Hey, here's a new security tools. It's pretty lightweight. Can you try it? When you're doing the web application development or API development. The developer will say, yes, we'll love to use it as long as you don't slow us down, right? So developers, they are really speed conscious. They don't want to have their performance being degraded by the security testing tools. That's totally understandable, but just to be realistic here, security, if you are adding security, it will slow down the process a little bit. Okay. So let's take a look at DevOps diagram here, but I have added some security components here. So when you're doing the coding or development, on the top here, you have the static analysis. Some of them are more like a spell checker like test that you can actually do for your code. Then there's a code review, either peer code review or automated secure code review tools. Right, and that's probably during the build. We are going to have open source component vulnerability scan during the development and also during the build. We want to do it during the build, at least we can actually do the scan during the build and to catch them. And then there are automated vulnerability assessment. This is when the application is actually running, right? You want to do a scan. This may not be done quickly. So you might have to create a separate pipeline, parallel pipeline for this to run, or do a schedule scan, right? Because this will run many hours, right? So you want to be in line in this DevOps pipeline, but you probably can just do the scan after you have the release. But if you find a vulnerability, you can just roll back. Okay? And the penetration testing. This is something, it's probably not possible to put it into the pipeline, but this is something that you want to consider. As we mentioned, the penetration testing, manual penetration testing, you do find more vulnerabilities that way. On the top, there's threat modeling. I want to bring it up because when you do the threat modeling, you understand who are the threat actor and what is the threat vector, what are some of the risks, so you can generate the security requirements for the developer to mitigate some of the risk ahead of time. Right? And also compliance on the bottom here, compliance validation. You also want to test make sure you comply with your security policy and also maybe some of the privacy policy as well. Okay. All right, so this is what I'm going to leave you with. So these are some of the recommendations for you to mitigate, reduce the web application vulnerabilities, and reduce the misconfigurations. I know we are at the end of the time. Just want to talk very quickly on the very bottom of the reduce configuration. Just want to mention that your DevOps environment, for example, Jenkins, I know Jenkins is popular DevOps environment, but make sure that these DevOps tools that Jenkins, they are patched because they are software. They're just like anything else. They do have vulnerabilities. Make sure you patch them and make sure that versions stay up to date, free of vulnerabilities. Because if you have vulnerabilities on Jenkins, Jenkins have access to the development, testing, staging, and the production environment. If you have a Jenkins tool get compromised, it will be very devastating for your organization. And make sure that Jenkins is not exposed on the internet. I know it's really obvious, right? Why do you actually want to put in Jenkins onto the internet? But there are mistakes being made. If you actually go out to the internet, you probably will find some of the Jenkins instances that are actually on the internet, which you probably want to make sure that you don't make it available on the internet. Okay, that's pretty much the end of my presentation here. And I want to see if we can take a couple of questions before we end our presentation.
Do you have something checklist for the developers, to reduce the vulnerabilities in the application? Like, this is something like from testing perspective, but more from the development perspective. What all they need to take additional steps to reduce the vulnerabilities?
Application security best practices. I have developed a few in the past. Maybe you can actually contact me. I share some of the secure coding practices. These are probably the best for the developers.
What does one do in case the latest version of the open source component that is critical for the application has a vulnerability?
Yeah, so it depends on how you use the open source to patch, right? Apply the latest version, but you have to do it carefully because it's very simple for me to say, yeah, just update the open source vulnerability in this critical library that you are using or critical API. But if this API actually going to be impacting a lot of other APIs, right? You probably want to make sure you update and then make sure you test it well.
There's another question from Urvish, who's asking to find vulnerabilities in open source applications. Can you please name any open source tool which can come handy?
There are some of them that are quite expensive, but we can start with OWASP. OWASP, they do have the dependency check. There's the tool that's been widely used, and it's actually been pretty effective. I know one of the top 5 bank in the US that's actually using OWASP dependency check. Name a few here. There are Sonatype by Synopsys, right? So there is the Black Duck tools out there, and there are like a White Source. So there are, and Microsoft, I think probably bought by Microsoft. So there are a few companies out there, but just some of them are not cheap, right? And there's Snyk as well. Yeah, those are actually not too cheap, but OWASP, you can actually start with the OWASP dependency check. That's a good place to start.
We do have a lot of questions. I think there are about 12 of them, but we're running out of time. So what I will do is we'll send you all these questions. If you can, when you have the time, and if you can answer these, then I'll share it back with the the people who ask these questions. I'll share it back with the community, if that's okay with you.
Absolutely. Yep, absolutely.
Meera, will this presentation be shared?
The video will be shared and not the presentation. So as a rule, we only share whatever we've shared on screen now, which is the video of Kyle presenting. Yes.
If you don't mind, I will actually send this over in the PDF version of the presentation, so you can share it with the audience.
Perfect. Will do. The audience, if you have any questions, please write in to us at contact@cisoplatform.com, We'll share it with Kyle, and like he mentioned, he's very, very generously given us the presentation. We will share it with you, all of you.
Thank you.
Right.
Thank you so much, Kyle. It's early in the morning for you to be able to do a session like this with so much energy. It's been brilliant. Thank you very, very much.
My pleasure.
Thank you so much. It was very nice.
Yeah, thank you so much.
Audience,
this was a good presentation, actually. Really good presentation.
Right, thank you.
Thank you so much, everybody. I'm just going to have to close this. We have another session starting at 5. So you can join in there if you want. Bye, Kyle.
Right, thank you.